Hello, I'm Michael Brown, President of the School for Advanced Research in Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's lecture by Dr. Glenn H. Shepard, Jr. Before I introduce Dr. Shepard, let me explain a little bit about the circumstance. You can tell from my virtual background that I am not at SAR. SAR is closed, as are all other institutions in the state of New Mexico by order of the governor in response to the coronavirus emergency. Glenn Shepard himself is in Washington, D.C., not in New York, teaching at Columbia University, which is where he's visiting this semester. Throughout this situation, SAR is going to be working tirelessly to take those events that were scheduled to be public events in Santa Fe, bring them to the web in a form that can be enjoyed by our members and our future members and all members of the public. The support and involvement of our members is welcome more than ever as we carry out our mission to promote creative thought and deliver quality content relevant to today's world. We're particularly grateful to those individuals, foundations, and businesses who've supported SAR's Creative Thought Forum lecture series for this year. These include the Pelham Foundation, John Camp and Michelle Cook, Patty and Arthur Newman through the Newman's Own Foundation, Adobo Catering, Bajarito Scientific Corporation, Thornburg Investment Management, the Flora Crichton Lecture Fund, and the Ethel Jane Westfeld Bunting Foundation. I'd also like to thank the sponsors for this particular lecture, who are Shiprock Santa Fe Dining, First National 1870 Bank, and Walter Burke Catering. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the tireless support of our board of directors and the members of SAR's Founder Society who make the Creative Thought Forum events possible. Glenn Shepard is a graduate of Princeton University. He received his doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley in a joint program with UC San Francisco. He's a distinguished medical anthropologist and ethnobotanist with expertise in the indigenous people of Brazil and Peru, Amazonia in general, but especially Peru and Brazil. He has an appointment at the Goeldi Museum in Belém, Brazil. He's currently a visiting professor of anthropology at Columbia University and working on a project with the American Museum of Natural History in New York. His blog, Notes from the Ethnoground, is, I think, one of the most exciting and best written anthropology blogs anywhere in the world, and I encourage you to take a look at it at your first opportunity. Before I do a handoff to Glenn, I just want to mention that we would welcome questions from viewers. They can be directed to the comments box under the video. We'd be grateful if you can indicate where you're visiting us from. Tell me where you're located. That helps us figure out who we're reaching in this process. We may not be able to take all the questions, but we'll take 3 or 4 before we end. And we look forward to doing this. We ask your patience as we work through this complex technology, which has all of us in a number of different places, but we think you'll enjoy it. And I look forward to hearing your questions at the end.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Glenn Shepard. I'm an anthropologist, originally from the US, now based in Brazil. And I'd like to thank the School for Advanced Research for this invitation. It's a place that I've always wanted to visit. I've never been in Santa Fe. The School for Advanced Research has a long and storied history. And I'm really, really disappointed I wasn't able to make it personally, but in these times of crisis, we all have to adapt to the situation. So we're doing this lecture by video conferencing. I would like to thank Michael Brown for the kind invitation and for his work through the years and inspiration, and also thank Meredith and Garrett for all the technical support in setting this up. So I'm going to be talking about my experience working in Brazil with the Kayapo indigenous peoples on a topic that's perhaps not the most typical anthropological topic. I'm going to be talking about how the Kayapo have used video in their struggles to get their rights and to express their culture. The Kayapo people are indigenous people of Brazil. They number today about 12,000 people. They live in between the Brazilian states of Pará, southern Pará, and northern Mato Grosso. So it's on the fringe areas of the Amazon. And but curiously enough, the Kayapo people, today they inhabit the Amazon, and they are considered perhaps the quintessential Amazonian peoples. But at the time of European colonization, they actually did not live in the Amazon at all. They lived in the Cerrado, the dry forests to the south of the Amazon. And it was only because of Western colonization, Portuguese colonization, that they were pushed forward into the Amazon region from the Cerrado region. And so they've been one of the great success stories in indigenous resistance, in the fact that they've been forced into this new environment, the Amazon, and they adapted their culture to that rainforest environment, and they sort of took over and captured the technology and the knowledge they needed to survive in the Amazon from their neighbors and enemies as they moved into the Xingu River. The Kayapo people, they have been at the forefront of indigenous people's political activism in the Amazon for many years. And in fact, in 1990, the Kayapo, a group of Kayapo warriors, Kube'i and Tapiet, visited the American Museum of Natural History in 1990. And they were there to visit, they were with anthropologist Terence Turner, a very well-known Kayapo expert who passed away recently. And they were in New York to visit. It was during the time when the Kayapo people were protesting the Belém Dam, the dam that the World Bank was initially going to finance. And largely because of the Kayapo's activism and organization, that dam was not funded by the World Bank and was only more recently funded and built by the Brazilian government a few years back. And so because the Kayapo were in New York, the curator of the American Museum, the South American curator for the American Museum, Robert Carneiro, was very eager for the Kayapo visitors with Terence Turner to visit recently, he just put up an exhibit in 1988. Robert Carneiro had just put up an exhibit about Amazonian peoples, and there's a very prominent Kayapo warrior mannequin in the exhibit. And so he invited these two Kayapo men, Tapiet and Kube'i, to visit the exhibit and have a chance to see it. And Robert Carneiro has told me that he was a bit apprehensive about this visit because, at least in those days, in the 1980s, when a curator set up an exhibit about indigenous peoples, it wasn't common for those peoples to actually come and visit it. So he was a bit concerned of this representation of this fierce Kayapo warrior holding the war club with the lip plug, how they would react to that, whether they felt they were being represented in a way that was distorted or unfair. And actually, the Kayapo loved it. Terence Turner was there to translate, and they said, this is exactly the way we want to be seen, as fierce warriors defending our lands. And they said, but however, he's missing a headdress and he's missing a necklace. And so the two men, Kube'i and Tapiet, they took off, Tapiet took off the feather crown that he was wearing and placed it on the mannequin. And I believe Kube'i took off some ear ornaments and placed it on the mannequin. And so they said, this is the way we want to be represented, but you're missing a few pieces. And so they placed it on the mannequin. And to this day, those pieces of Kayapo body ornamentation are on this mannequin. And I'm actually, this semester, until the coronavirus outbreak, I was working in the American Museum to make a new exhibit talking about the way the Kayapos have evolved in their use of media and so on. That exhibit will probably be supposed to be open in May. We'll see what happens with that now. So, why isn't it advancing? So the Kayapo have had this long engagement with the media as a way of defending their territory and their cultural rights and their political rights in Brazil. Terence Turner had, when he took the two Kayapo to visit the American Museum in 1991, he had recently made a film called Out of the Forest about the Kayapo struggles against the Belém Dam and their struggles to maintain their territories. And as part of this larger protest movement, Terence Turner helped the Kayapo acquire video cameras for the first time. Grenada Films was making the film about this land struggle, and the Kayapo were very interested in getting their own video cameras. And there's an iconic image of, in 1988, there was a large protest movement in Altamira in the state of Pará, near where the dam was eventually built, in which the Kayapo and other forest peoples gathered together to protest to representatives of the Brazilian government and the Brazilian power company. And this is a very famous picture of the Kayapo female chief, Tuire, shaking a machete in the face of this representative of the Brazilian power company that was going to build the dam. And this image sort of stood out in the media as being an iconic representation of the Kayapo people's resistance to these development projects and their capacity to organize and to project their image as a warrior people to defend their lands. And with this film, Out of the Forest, the Kayapo people, they began to understand the power of media and cameras in defending their political and cultural rights and land rights. And so during this film, the Kayapo people were given, they were given video cameras, and they were trained to use video cameras. And what they did is they went to visit existing dam sites in Brazil, and they filmed the devastation in these dams, and they brought those images back to the Kayapo villages to show to the people, to say, this is what's going to happen to our land if we're allowed to build this dam. And this use of sort of a kind of primitive video conferencing. You know, they were looking at remote images of a place that they had never visited. A few cameramen visited, brought the images back, and when they realized how bad these dams were going to be, that helped them mobilize for this big meeting in Altamira that eventually led to the World Bank canceling the funding for the project. And so the Kayapo have really been at the forefront of what is now known as indigenous media. They have been at the forefront of learning to use video technology, appropriating that technology for their own cultural purposes. And Terence Turner, our dear departed friend, has written a lot about how the Kayapo have appropriated technology and how they've projected their image as warriors to defend their lands. And we see that this same tendency goes through the very present day. There's the famous photograph of Tuire threatening the Kayapo, threatening the Brazilian power company represented with the machete. And to this day, in the center of the photo, you see Tuire lecturing a group of visitors. I was among a group of visitors to her village 3 years ago. And she was lecturing us about the dangers of gold mining, the dangers of the dams, and so on, the ongoing dangers. And then in 2019, to the left side of your screen, there's Chief Ngreika Moro. She's a female chief. There are, it's not common among the Kayapo, but there are several standout female chiefs who are leading in this struggle, like Tuire in the 1980s. And Ngreika Moro, in an interview with the Financial Times in 2019, with the newly arrived Bolsonaro administration and all the threats that they were representing to indigenous peoples, this female chief, Ngreika Moro, held up when the journalist André Schipani for the Financial Times asked her what would she do about Bolsonaro if he continued to denigrate indigenous peoples. She grabbed her machete and said, "I'll cut his mouth off." So we see that the Kayapo have this, they've had this long-term constant engagement with the media as a way of promoting their rights. And and video has been a very important part of this very early on. During Terence Turner's work on the Grenada project, there were a total of three Kayapo cameramen. At that point, there were only Kayapo cameramen, male cameramen, who were trained. Mokuka was one of the first ones, and he was actually in the Brazilian House of Congress in 1988. This image on the left, he was filming the signing of the Brazilian Constitution. It's a very famous scene where the indigenous peoples are present at the arguments over the Constitution to make sure indigenous land rights are part of the Constitution. And Mokuka was there filming it. And then there's an image down below of Mokuka in his new career as a Kayapo pop singer, which we will talk about later on in the talk. And then Kiabeti, who was a very close friend of anthropologist Terence Turner, 3 years ago, he was recognized in an international award for his ongoing work as a video warrior. And in the interview, he did an interview for National Geographic where he explained that the Kayapo people see the video camera as a kind of weapon that they use to defend themselves. So my involvement with the Kayapo is much more recent. I've worked in different parts of the Amazon, in the Peruvian Amazon for many years. And then in 2009, I was hired at the Goeldi Museum in Belém. And I'd never, I'd read a lot about the Kayapo, and they're this force of nature in indigenous politics in Brazil. They're always on TV. They're this incredibly colorful people with these amazing ceremonies and so on. So there were people that I'd read about and I'd seen a lot in the media, but I never worked with them. And then when I came to the Goeldi Museum in 2009, I was called on to become the curator of the ethnographic collections in the absence. The curator for many years was on leave in Brasilia because her husband had taken over the directorship of the Brazilian Indigenous Foundation, FUNAI, and so I was sort of the interim curator of these collections. And within the first 2 months of my curatorship, a large group of Kayapo showed up in the collections to visit it with a French anthropologist who'd worked with them, Pascal de Robert, and they visited the collections and they very much enjoyed their visit. And they came to me and they said, we want you to help us come back and visit the collections, but we need cameras and we need training so that we can record what's going on here and show to the people in the villages, and also make films, because in the museum we're very appreciative that you have kept these Kayapo artifacts for all these 100 or so years since they've been collected, but we want people to know that we still make these artifacts and we still have our rituals. We haven't lost any of this stuff. It's in the museum, but just because it's in the museum doesn't mean that we've forgotten it. And so they literally came to me and said, will you train us to make films and come to our villages and help us film the villages? And I said, of course. I mean, that's sort of the anthropologist's dream. Rather than showing up in a village and saying, here's what I want to do, the chief comes to you in your office in the university and says, come work with us. So that's how I got involved with the Kayapo. And I'm still learning the language, I'm still learning the culture. It's a very complex culture. But at this point, I've been working with the Kayapo about 10 years. And so, the initial project was about, we have this large collection of Kayapo objects in the museum, in the Goeldi Museum in Belém. And one of the earliest collections in the museum was a group of Kayapo objects collected in 1902 by a Catholic priest, Fray Gil de Villanova. He was a priest who was working with the Kayapo in the early 20th century, and he sold a large collection of objects to the Kayapo, to the Goeldi Museum in the early 20th century to support his missionary work. And the group that Fray Gil collected among and worked with is called the Ira Amrai. The Kayapo people, there's a single cultural group known as Kayapo, but in that group there are many different villages and languages and subgroups that in the past were at war with each other sometimes. And one of those subgroups was called the Ira Amrai, and they basically went culturally extinct because of epidemics and because of integration. They were near a small Brazilian town, and Conceição da Araguaia, and basically they went extinct as a cultural group soon after this visit to the museum. And so in a way, these Ira Amrai objects in the collection are the last sort of material vestiges of this people. And during their visit, they were photographed, and around the museum park, there are these sort of ghostly life-size photos of these Ira Amrai Kayapo people who visited the Goeldi in 1902. And I couldn't resist taking a photograph of the Kayapo people today standing alongside this 100-year-old ghost of the same cultural group. So the Kayapo, curiously enough, at the time that the Kayapo came to visit us in the collections, it coincided with the swine flu outbreak in 2019. And now we're going through something quite similar, perhaps arguably much worse today. And so when the Kayapo first came into contact with the museum collections, they were very wary about the odor. When you go into the collections deposit, we have dehumidifiers working, and there's this smell of sort of dried palm leaves, because there's a lot of palm fibers in there. So there's this sort of unusual smell, and they were very concerned about this odor, which they thought was a representation of the owners of these objects. When the Kayapo die, many of their most prestigious objects, such as their feather crowns and these necklaces that you can see in the photograph, their satellite TV antenna, their beds, the sports trophies that have been won in their village, all of the things are piled on top of their grave. And the idea is that the dead person sort of takes these material objects with them. And in this collection space where these objects from all these hundreds of cultures and these old objects, the odor for them was a representation of of the spirit, the owners of these dead people. And they were a bit worried about it. But when they saw that we had they were just traveling through Brazil, through airports and bus stations and so on, and they were seeing on the news that everyone was wearing surgical masks to protect themselves from the H1N1, the swine flu virus. And so they figured, since these are sort of standard part, the rubber gloves and the masks were available to our museum staff when they're handling fragile objects, they decided that if it protects them against swine flu, it could protect them against these old the spirits of the dead that were living in the collection. So they decided that by wearing the mask, they were protected. And their word for these dead spirits that inhabit, that maintain this ongoing relationship with the objects, is mecaron. And mecaron means literally image. It can be used to refer to a dead person, a ghost, but it also refers to a human image, such as a mask, or a mask, or a doll representation of a human is mecaron, and also images, photographic images and video images are mecaron. And so the Kayapo word for video camera is also mecaron. So it's this idea that the mecaron is an image, a ghostly image. And so in addition to the work in the museum exhibit, looking at the Kayapo objects and photographing them and recording them, the Kayapo were especially interested in learning how to make films. And they wanted, so we used the grant money to buy them cameras and to get them laptops and to do some basic training in filmmaking. And at this point, there had been the original Kayapo filmmakers that Terence Turner had trained in the 1980s, but this is a fairly distant region. There hadn't been any real sort of direct contact with those filmmakers. But they were very interested in getting the films, and they started making their own films very quickly. And what was striking is that, I've taught ethnographic film before, and usually you have your students go out and make a film without much instruction. They come back to the editing suite, they realize they can't use anything because it's filmed very poorly, and then they learn how to make a film according to sort of standard filmmaking techniques. But with the Kayapo, I sent them back to their villages with their first cameras, expecting they'd bring all this amateur sort of film with them. And actually what they brought back was really remarkable footage. And it seems as though the Kayapo, they were just natural filmmakers. There was something about the culture, these spectacular rituals that are done on a repeated basis, and the color of it, and the fact that the entire village participates in these rituals and everyone knows what's going on in the rituals. So they actually turned out to be much better filmmakers than I could ever be, because they understood exactly they understood the visual language of their own rituals in a way that even a trained filmmaker using our visual language can't represent it. And so I was really struck with the quality of their videos and the production quality. And as I began reading up, the anthropologist Terence Turner, who had taken the Kayapo to New York, who had helped him get the cameras, he'd written about what he calls sort of what he describes a video making aesthetic. And in his writings, he shows how when you look at the way Kayapo make films about rituals, that filmmaking process recapitulates the ritual process itself, in the sense that you have these the traditional concepts of beauty and truth involve transmitting ancient symbols and ancient patterns into the present moment and constantly updating them in the present moment through their repetition in the current day. And he identifies a number of aspects of the way the Kayapo filmmakers were making films, the perfection and repetition of the movements, their ease in capturing circular motion, the way that they included all participants in a way that didn't truncate the film in any way, that didn't cut out any important parts of the ritual. He showed how their techniques of filmmaking are an almost perfect reproduction of the ritual process itself, in the sense that and films have become the perfect way to record rituals, because these rituals have a lot of social functions. For example, when people receive certain kinds of special honorary name titles, the name, and these are very important for Kayapo people as a form of ritual prestige. And if the ritual isn't done properly, then the name doesn't have the value. It would be sort of like in Europe, when some noble people would buy their titles rather than inheriting them, they would be considered sort of less noble people because they bought their titles. And so if a Kayapo person receives a special valuable name that wasn't received properly in the ritual, then that name loses its value. And so the act of registering these rituals provides proof that the ceremonial prestige that was conveyed in these rituals is valid. And so this concept of ceremonial prestige in the Kayapo language is referred to as nekre or nekrech. And many anthropologists have written about this. Nekre it's a relationship between people and objects and prestige. And different anthropologists have referred to it as cultural, as sort of an equivalent of what we call cultural heritage. Turner described it as ceremonial wealth. And Vanessa Lee describes it as prerogative, in the sense that when these things are inherited, these special kinds of wealth are inherited, they give the owners of them the prerogative to then pass them on to their family. And in past times, when the Kayapo were often at war with one another, they refer to these as the times of war. What they would do is it wasn't really warfare in our sense of like invading a territory and taking over. It was really more raiding parties, and the raiding parties would attack a neighboring village or an enemy village, and they would take away specific objects. They would take away especially weapons, ornaments, names, and songs. And these are objects that the Kayapo in Kayapo culture, these are important. They're important categories of objects and prestige that you capture for the enemies, and then you incorporate into their cultural group through these ceremonies. And it was curious when we visited the collections, when the Kayapo would describe different objects they found, they would always start by saying, "This object here is not Kayapo. They captured it from their enemy somewhere." And as the people the anthropologists who knew the material objects said, well, actually, most of them were very typical Kayapo objects. But the curious thing is that in their minds, an object has more value if it's not Kayapo. It's more valuable if it's a non-Kayapo object. It's an enemy object that was captured in warfare and then incorporated into the culture. And so in current times, you can see an echo of this concept in the Kre, and this idea of cultural appropriation, in the way that Kayapo have incorporated firearms, all sorts of trade goods, beads, maps, cameras, and computers. They all seem to fit into this cultural logic of nekre, which involves capturing the songs, the names, the weapons, the ornaments, the technology of your enemy, reincorporating it through these proper rituals into your own culture, and then displaying and using these things as trophies of war. So what we might call in the West cultural assimilation, for the Kayapo is actually an expression of their culture. The fact that they're using video cameras and laptops, there's that famous Gary Larson cartoon of the anthropologists coming, hide your cameras, hide your video machines. The idea that is somehow inauthentic, that indigenous peoples who use the technology are inauthentic. Whereas for the Kayapo, capturing weapons, capturing technology, capturing knowledge is an essential part of their culture. And so one of the first films that was made was a really shocking, for all the anthropologists, it was a very shocking film. It was the first film made by the Kayapo filmmaker named Tatajiri, and it was of a Miss Kayapo beauty contest in a nearby town. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause my screen share now and play a short clip of this film of the Miss Kayapo beauty contest. So this is a film, it was the very first film made by this Kayapo filmmaker, Tatajiri, of this really striking beauty contest in a nearby town. And so just as a short summary, the 5 villages who are participating, it's in a small town called Orilandia, Gold Town, because it was a sort of gold rush town. It's a small town on the frontier, and it was the birthday of the city, and so the mayor invited the Kayapo to hold this ceremony, which is sort of what they call the Miss Kayapo beauty contest. And in the first bit, each village does a traditional dance and presents their candidate. And in the second part of the video, I'll show some clips of the beauty candidates walking and doing the sort of doing the beauty pageant part of this beauty contest.
Secretários que compõem a nossa secretaria também, parabenizar esse grupo indígena que veio participar conosco. E para fechar, os secretários que compõem a nossa administração estão aqui observando, prestigiando aqui as apresentações indígenas.
So that's sort of the introduction to this beauty pageant, where each village comes and presents its candidate and does a traditional dance. And then as we move forward, you can see it's in the middle of a fairground there's a rock band playing in the background and Ferris wheels and so on. And then as we move forward, we go to the Miss Kayapo part. So, I mean, the first thing to observe is that this was the first this was the first time this young man had ever held a camera and had ever edited a film. And just the extraordinary quality of this for a novice filmmaker, just dealing with a very complex public situation like that, all this movement, all these people around everywhere, and just did an amazing job editing and shooting and editing this thing for a first film. But then you, as an anthropologist, you're sort of flabbergasted, and your first reaction is, oh my God, this is horrendous. This is this horrible perversion of traditional culture. There are these young women, mocking Brazilian models, waving their hips, doing these sexy moves. It's this very shocking kind of thing to look at. But when we asked the filmmakers, I asked, but don't you think isn't this denigrating traditional culture? I mean, here you have these young women imitating Western models. And he said a very curious thing. He said, we're showing the Kayapo women as beautiful. They're beautiful as Kayapo and as Brazilians at the same time. So in the Kayapo logic, this is not an assimilation or a perversion of their traditional culture. And as you can see, they made a very strong point of, the first half of the contest was this traditional dance, each village presenting their candidate in the traditional way, and then the second half they have their individual candidates doing the beauty contest. And so in a sense, whereas our outside perspective would be that, oh, this is horrible, it's exploitative, it's exploiting the sensuality of young women. But for them, it's their chance they sort of get to have it both ways. They get to be beautiful as Kayapo and as Brazilians at the same time. And I think this, I've written about how the cultural logic behind this is not a logic of assimilation or of cultural loss. It's actually the other way around. It's their way of conquering a space in Brazilian popular culture. And it has to go, and it has to do with this concept of necre that I mentioned, in that this idea of capturing from the enemy these prestigious objects. And it's not just objects, it's knowledge, it's even songs. And so the Amaraiti people, the Kayapo subgroup that was basically, went extinct in the early 20th century, and the objects are still there in the museum, they were considered to be an extremely warlike people. And all, the Kayapo, to this day, the Kayapo sort of have there's this kind of awe towards the Amaraiti. They were very feared warriors. And when I went back to the villages and showed them the videos and the photos that we've been doing with the Kayapo in the museum, and said, these are Amaraiti objects, one of the men in the village stood up and he says, my grandfather remembers the Amaraiti because they were his enemies. And he taught us this song. And so he stands up and he sings a hunting song. It's a peccary hunting song. And everyone's laughing at it because it's the Amaraiti. It's a different dialect of Kayapo, and so things are pronounced slightly differently. And so he makes a big point of singing this hunting song with these sort of this dialect with these different sounding words and so on. And everyone sort of laughed about it, the pronunciation of the words being different. But what was curious is that the memory of this warlike group has persisted among the culture for over 100 years. And the idea is that these feared warriors, yet this group of Kayapo that survived to today had captured one of the Amaraiti songs. And so by capturing a song from this feared enemy and then transmitting it through the culture, it shows their power as a sort of, we have survived and we've kept the memory of these Amaraiti alive, these fierce warriors, and we can still sing their songs. And so there's this idea that songs captured from the enemies are a source of prestige. And reading up on this, there's a story of another Kayapo group called the Cararao, and like the Amaraiti in the early 20th century, the Cararao were contacted in the late 1960s, and by the mid 1970s, when this is an anthropologist at the Goeldi Museum who who basically documented the demise of this group. They were contacted in the 1960s, and by the late 1970s, the group was basically decimated by diseases, and they were assimilated, and it basically went extinct as a group. And so this anthropologist from the Goeldi Museum wrote an article, "The Extinction of the Cararao Kayapo Indians in the Lower Xingu." It was a region that was colonized very heavily. And in this article, he makes this passing reference that a friend of mine pointed out to me, that, and this is, the Cararao were at the time, they were what we call today, quote unquote, uncontacted Indians. They were Indians who had not yet succumbed to diseases. They had not yet sort of succumbed to outside influence and assimilation. They were living on their own. We would call them uncontacted or voluntarily isolated Indians. And yet, in the Expedito Arnaud, the anthropologist, he observed that in certain rituals, the Kayapo were singing these songs that had very, very familiar melodies. And as he documented, he realized that these were melodies of very, very typical, common Brazilian folk songs, sort of like the equivalent of nursery rhymes in the United States. There's this whole tradition in especially Northeast Brazil, where a lot of these immigrants were coming for the gold rush and for the land rush in the 1960s and 70s. They're sort of folk songs like the equivalent of, She'll Be Coming Around the Mountain or Banjo on My Knee. They're that kind of really, really typical folk songs from the Brazilian frontier. And he documented dozens of these folk songs. There's a famous one called Mulher Rendeira. Olá, mulher rendeira, olá, mulher renda. And you'll find, hundreds and hundreds of covers of the song. It's a really classic Brazilian folk song from the Northeast that artists, children's songs and artists do different versions of it. And so these quote unquote isolated, uncontacted Kayapo Indians had learned all of these Brazilian folk songs. And the hypothesis is that as the women were out washing their clothes in the rivers, the Kayapo were sitting there listening to them and listening to these songs. And they felt it was important enough. There was these enemy white people who were there invading their lands. And yet in their culture, it was important for them to imitate at least the melodies of these songs. And they were sort of trying to imitate the lyrics of these songs. And so, and in certain rituals, rituals of warfare, the Kayapo would sing these captured war songs of these neighboring Brazilian peoples. And so when we go to the next chapter of my presentation about something that I call Kaya pop music, we want to keep this idea in mind. Today, there's a phenomenon which I've called Kaya pop, and it is these Kayapo singers who create Kayapo, mostly Kayapo lyrics to these very popular dance songs, forró, tecnobrega, and so on. And in these public festivals, the village will have an anniversary party, or a neighboring town will have an anniversary party. There'll be a soccer match between villages, and these Kaya pop singers will present and sing these Kayapo pop songs. So now I'm going to play an excerpt. This is Bep Jude. He's a Kayapo man from the region of Novo Progresso in Mato Grosso, and he is one of the more prominent Kaya pop singers. And I'm going to play a little excerpt from one of his songs. Baby Judy.
Jaga boy que dalam kumuten, kona mi matu alek yang jam, jame punu jamai ta kumuten, ale meme ale mono menem, jame kale kumku aben kumong, jedang jaga iyo wano. Ora que teme o ayowane, la kunkati wane inyowa,
this whole phenomenon of these Kayapo, what I call Kaya pop singers, these Kayapo pop singers. And whereas, you know, again, from the outside, we might think of this as this, you know, this, oh, they're losing their culture, they're, you know, they're succumbing, they're giving up their beautiful dance and singing traditions to imitate the West. But if you look back into Kayapo culture, this is not losing the war, this is winning the war, this is capturing the enemy songs. And so now I'm going to show you an excerpt. Remember Mokuka? Mokuka, the Kayapo filmmaker? Well, he's had this, this twilight career in his older days as a Kayapo pop singer. And he came to this, on April 19th is National Indian Day in Brazil, Indigenous Day. And Indigenous, there's all through the country, there's celebrations of Indigenous heritage, and Indigenous villages often have these, they'll have these multi-ethnic parties led by different groups, and they'll throw these big festivals honoring Indigenous heritage. They'll have Indigenous Olympics, they'll have soccer games and so on. And so Mokuka, this pioneering Kayapo filmmaker, who's now a pop singer, he came to the village and he remarked about how beautiful all the young women were. There was this group of women on the stage with Bepjiri, sort of like the Miss Kayapo style dressing, sort of blending Western style, sort of sexualized erotic dress with the Kayapo ornaments. They were on stage with Bepjiri, and he decided to write a song about all these beautiful young women that he was seeing. And so what I'm going to show you is an excerpt of it was a video that one of the, I wasn't even here, this was all done by them. A Kayapo video maker named Krankrai filmed and edited this, a video of this whole celebration. And there's a section where he shows Mokuka singing the song Tem Mulher Bonita. The song means, basically there's lots of pretty women. And so he sings this song about how, and he very explicitly says, there's pretty women in the city, there's pretty women in the village, there's pretty young Indian women, there's pretty young white women. So the whole song, it's a rare thing among Kayapo pop music in that it's actually composed in Portuguese. And so it's this whole song about appreciating beauty among women, sort of across, having it both ways. They can be beautiful as Kayapo and as Brazilians. And so this is a video, it's an excerpt of video that it's kind of very meta here. It's my film of a group of Kayapo people watching the film that this Kayapo filmmaker made. So I filmed a very short section of the people sitting around on a Sunday afternoon watching this, and they watched this video just for months and months, over and over again. They were fascinated to watch their own village festival over and over and over again. And so I'm going to show you a little excerpt of Mokuka singing Tem Mulher Bonita.
Kayapo
The curious thing about this was that the young woman who was dancing alongside Mokuka, the Kayapo, especially the Kayapo men, were fascinated by this sort of this very erotic dancing, which is typical of Brazilian. There's a whole style of Brazilian music called axé, where each new song, and even funk today, each new song comes out, and the song is associated with a very specific, often very eroticized dance by a woman, and then the whole sort of the song plus the dance becomes this fashion, and so the men were just fascinated, like they couldn't take their eyes off this young woman, and they said to me, she says, now she's the only one who can dance like that. No other Kayapo woman knows how to dance like that. And they said she's from this village called Kubinkankren, which is this very remote village, way up in the middle of Kayapo territory. And they said that she sat in front of, she had these videos that she downloaded from somewhere of these Brazilian dancers doing these axé movements. And they said she practiced for months and months and months to get it right. And they were just sort of astounded. Wow, there's this Kayapo woman who can dance just like those Brazilian fashion models can dance. And they said she's the only Kayapo. There's no one else can do that. She's the only one. She sat in front of some sort of screen in her remote village and practiced for months getting ready for this performance. And so again, it's the kind of thing that from the outside it's easy to look upon it and say, oh, they're losing their culture, they're exoticizing, they're eroticizing their culture, this is horrible. But from the Kayapo perspective, there's this other vision that they're capturing something and they're doing it with pride. And the song itself is all about how these Kayapo women, they're beautiful in the city and in the village. So they're projecting Kayapo culture out into the Brazilian, eroticized Brazilian world. And now for this one, I'm going to ask everyone to just listen, and when you recognize it, raise your hand, okay? And we'll see how long it takes people to get this one. So that's right, you just heard the Kayapo cover of Hey Jude. I was literally leaving the village, getting my bags together, getting ready to cross the stream and go back, and I heard this sound. I was like, what? No, that can't be. So I sort of followed the sound. I just had a cell phone with me. I followed the sound, tracked it to the little hut where these boys were listening to it, and yes, I was listening to the Kayapo cover of Hey Jude. So again, within the Kayapo logic, we talk about the British invasion. Well, guess what? This is the Kayapo invasion. So when there was a group of anthropologists, Saul Worth and John Adair, who gave film cameras, old-fashioned black and white film cameras, to the Navajo back in the 1970s. And there was this project called Through Navajo Eyes. And the idea was that every culture would have, when you give an indigenous culture a camera, they would create their own aesthetic, their own way of their worldview. We talk about anthropological worldviews. Well, that worldview would be expressed in this, they would have this unique way of making films. And a lot of anthropologists, and especially in the 1990s, very sharply criticized this idea that there could ever be any authentic indigenous engagement with digital media or with film media. The idea being that all of these things, the cameras themselves, the production of the cameras, they're so intricately tied up with capitalism and Western media and news and manipulation that there's no way that indigenous people could ever overcome that colonial cultural baggage that goes behind the production and the making, the production of cameras and the making of films. And that the idea that there could be any such thing as an authentic indigenous film was ridiculous. But more recently, anthropologists, among them the leading one being Faye Ginsberg, who's worked with Aboriginal Australian filmmakers, she talks about how indigenous filmmakers create this sort of hybrid culture, where she calls it parallax, where you sort of like with stereo vision, you're sort of looking at indigenous culture and Western culture with these new eyes, and you sort of get a new three-dimensional stereoscopic perspective on indigenous realities. And she talks about the Faustian contract, where there's this contract with this outside technology, but is it going to give too much away? And so scholars working with the Kayapo, myself and others included, have said, well, no, there's no Faustian contract here. This has always been the Kayapo way of capturing the enemy's weapons and turning them against the enemy to defend their culture. When we look at this whole history of the Kayapo's engagement with digital media and film and pop music, even beauty contests, we can see that, all peoples are like this. All people are constantly changing. But somehow from the West, with our sort of museological idea of culture, the idea is that, we can change. We can get the latest iPhone, we get Twitter, we move on to the next social media platform. We're always changing, but these indigenous peoples, they're the ones who sort of always need to stay the same, because if they don't change, they lose something essential about their material culture, about their culture, their songs, and so on. But obviously, all peoples are changing all the time. And in the Kayapo case, specifically, this concept of nakre and this idea of rituals is constantly bringing these ancient forms into the present. There's something very unique and special about the way the Kayapo have engaged with these new forms of media as a way of transmitting their culture into the present and constantly reappropriating these outside technologies, but appropriating in a way that is uniquely Kayapo and that is appropriated in defense of their culture. And so that the idea is that these appropriations, they're not forms of assimilation. Instead, they're forms of a kind of capture, a cultural warfare, where they're capturing these trophies from the West, from us, and using them for their own means and within their own cultural logic to defend their culture. And in today's Amazon, especially, we see that this dynamism of indigenous cultures is essential for the survival of the Amazon. In the Amazon basin, over half of all protected areas, national park, all categories, national parks, forest reserves, indigenous reserves, if you add them all up, more than half of them are indigenous reserves. And in Brazil particularly, indigenous areas are more than 5 times the total area of national parks, 1 million square kilometers of indigenous lands. And scientific studies have showed that these indigenous reserves are, if not the same, they're perhaps more effective than parks, strictly protected parks, in stopping deforestation and forest fires. And you can literally look, with the past, especially the past year and a half in Brazil, with this new administration in Brazil, which has opened up, sort of given a green light to illegal foresters and land grabbers and gold miners, to just a blank check to invade indigenous lands. And the image below is a panoramic image of the Kayapo village where I first started working, which has since been invaded by hundreds of gold miners, and they've destroyed, thousands and thousands of hectares of. These are forests that I used to go fishing with the Kayapo, fishing and hunting in these same areas, and now they're just destroyed for the rest. For hundreds of years they've been completely destroyed. And so, way back in the 1980s, Daryl Posey, who was a well-known anthropologist and ethnobotanist who worked with the Kayapo people. And he was one of the people that helped the Kayapo get to New York and organize against the Belém Dam. He was a key figure. And he, in the first International Society of Ethnobiology meetings in 1988 in Belém, the same city where I work, they did a declaration, the Declaration of Belém, talking about the inextricable link between culture and biodiversity. That today biodiversity, you cannot protect biodiversity without protecting cultural diversity. You can't protect animal species without protecting indigenous cultures. And recently, in 2018, we had the 30-year reunion of the Belém biodiversity, of the Belém Ethnobiology Conference, and we released a new, updated Belém Plus 30 Declaration of Belém. And so we see through these 30 years of Kayapo people's culture, there's been this strong warrior ethos that has motivated them to back in the 1980s, from their very self-conscious use of their image, of their painted bodies, their headdresses, their warrior image, facing off against these Brazilian authorities with a machete. And then, over the years, this conscious use of video cameras as a weapon to protect themselves, and all the way up to this Ngereka Kayapo chief just a year ago, learning of the Bolsonaro, as indigenous people were just being exposed to the Bolsonaro government in Brazil's depredations and threats to indigenous culture. She stood up and said, if he keeps talking like this, I will cut his mouth off. And so the Kayapo have been very savvy in their use of their own image and of Western technologies to confront these threats. And this is an image of the Xingu region where the Kayapo indigenous lands are located. And you can literally see the border of the Kayapo territory on satellite images and on aerial photographs. Everything to the left of that image is cattle pasture. And that specific line, that tree line that you see, that is the geographical boundary of Kayapo territory, because, at least until last year, people respected those territories because they knew the Kayapo would, crack some heads if people come in. But now, under the Bolsonaro administration, you've seen this massive uptick in deforestation, in illegal gold mining, and so on. So the dynamism of these indigenous cultures, like the Kayapo, is something that's not just important for their cultural survival and well-being. It's important for the entire Amazon basins, the entire South American continent, the entire world's survival. Because if anything, the past couple years have shown us that all the climate predictions that were being made, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, if anything, there was always sort of the conservative estimate, and then the worst case scenario estimate, and the sort of intermediate estimate. And what we found over the past couple of years is that what we considered the worst case scenario estimate 5 years ago is turning out to be the conservative estimate today, and that things are moving much faster than anyone ever thought. And people fear that the Amazon basin could very quickly approach a tipping point where all of that carbon that's been stored for, thousands, perhaps millions of years in these trees, tens of thousands of years to be sure, if things continue going in this direction and deforestation doesn't stop and the rain cycle is interrupted, all of this forest could suddenly turn into this huge bunch of kindling, and the forest dries out and suddenly goes up in flames. And if this sort of status quo isn't stopped, we could see over the next 100 years the Amazon being reduced to something like 15% of its current size. So that is the end of my talk. I thank you for putting up with this remote access. It's sort of a new thing for all of us, and I look very much forward to your questions.
I'm here. I'm attempting to fix. Give me a second. Can you guys speak so that I can hear if it's... One more second, guys. I can hear myself, but I can't hear you. Meredith, do you have control of the meeting? Could you guys speak one more time? I have a 17-second delay between when you speak and when I can check it on YouTube. It, um, can you guys do a countdown? Yep. I'm still not hearing you guys. That's what's odd. So somebody's running YouTube in the background and it's looping through. That's what's happening. I have no method of unmuting you guys. I think so. Hold on a second.